Hey everyone, One Dragon here. Today I'm going to discuss my essential build tips for Cyberpunk 2077, updated for patch 1.6 and 1.61. In this video I'm going to go over a bunch of important mechanics for builds, a lot of which are hidden or just not properly explained, and as a result are often ignored. Some of these tips have existed since launch, while others are based on the most recent patches from 1.5 to 1.61. This video will go over some basic mechanics for new players and some complicated mechanics for veterans. The tips are based on very hard gameplay and in some cases will be overkill for lower difficulties. There's quite a few spreadsheets or tables in the video that I've been working on related to different loot or stack combinations that you can find, so be sure to look out for those. Tip number 1, plan your build. First of all, there is a maximum of 71 attribute points. Every attribute starts at 3 or 15 in total, then you get 7 in character creation and another 49 points from leveling all the way to level 50. Given that you can't max out every tree and cannot respec attributes, where you allocate your attribute points is really important for story related decisions, looting rooms, opening doors, and of course builds. If you decide to do a full level 50 run, you should get around 100 to 120 perk points depending on where you allocate your attributes. You gain perk points from 3 sources, 1 perk point per level, training and leveling up your perk progression, and finally 10 perk shards that you can find throughout the world. I've seen some build videos that have modded or save edited way too many perks or have 20 perk progression despite not having 20 attribute points, so watch out for those videos. One thing to consider when planning is that many weapons have had their body requirements changed in recent patches. However, the Gorilla Arms now add 2, 4, or 6 body depending on the rarity. The Gorilla Arms body increase does not change your attributes and does not impact dialogue, but it works on weapons and doors. Tip number 2. Attributes and perks are a bigger share of damage modifiers. If you decide to play the game in patches 1.3 or earlier and you decide to min-max your damage, the majority of damage modifiers were on weapons, and as they fixed clothing mod stacking, clothing had insane crit or damage stats. As such, you could pick any attribute spread and have a good build just by using legendary weapons and stacking clothing mods. However, there were massive nerfs in patch 1.5 that limited clothing mods to specific pieces and halved the number of clothing mod slots. Although all damage got nerfed, your perk and attribute spread has never been more important to overall builds, specifically looking at damage output. This brings me to my third tip: don't sleep on the ultimate or capstone perks. There were so many broken perks from release and continued until about 1.3 when they started being fixed. However, since patch 1.5, they've been fixed and are very important to DPS. I personally invest 20 to 40 perk points into these level 20 perks, and this allows me to consistently deal good damage. Your use of capstone perks will separate the low damage builds from the high ones. I always recommend at least one of these capstone perks per build, and of course you can stack 2 or 3 to really optimize or min-max that damage. A good example would be tech handguns, which can make use of the level 20 handguns perk, the good, the bad, the ugly, the level 20 engineering perk, revamp, and the level 20 cold blood perk, merciless. Next, use the Roleplay Buffs. CDPR added 3 role-playing buffs that you can access in your apartments. The most significant to all builds is the sleeping buff. It increases progression experience gain by 20%. This significantly reduces the grind it takes to level your perk progressions. There's also the coffee or stamina buff, which is good for melee, improving stamina regen, and showering helps with health regen if you get hit. The next one is a little bit more complicated, but know your threat levels. You can see a rough guide to threat levels in the journal, and it's shown as the danger level, but you can also check the icon above enemies for the color code. The red skull being very high, then it swaps to the normal enemy type icons, but if the color is an orangey red, then it's a high threat enemy. Yellow or the same color as the health bar is medium, green is low, and gray is very low. Threat level is a rough guide showing you if you are below the enemy's level or above them, and by how much. So what does threat level do? If you are low leveling or fighting enemies that are a high threat level, all damage sources from weapons to quick hacks have reduced damage. Even a quick hack like the suicide quick hack, which generally one-hits enemies, if you use it on a high threat level enemy, it might not one-hit them. Also, from a defensive standpoint, you'll likely get 1 or 2 shot no matter how much armor you stack, because enemies gain damage bonuses as well. Also, grappling from stealth won't work, and quick hacks upload slower and cost significantly more RAM. Inversely, if you are fighting enemies that are well below your level or fighting enemies at a low or very low threat level, you'll gain significant damage multipliers to all your damage, and enemies will also deal less damage. You should notice that quick hacks are uploaded at a normal speed and their RAM costs are reduced. At launch, I believe the damage multiplier for very low was something like 2 times, but I'm certain that this has been reduced after patch 1.5, but there is definitely still a damage buff in effect. So this means that even though enemies scale in HP, leveling will always favor the player due to these extra damage modifiers. For this reason, if I'm on a level 50 character, I test new weapons on open world enemies and the level 50 quest, Don't Fear the Reaper, so that enemies are at least at a medium threat level. The threat level system makes low damage builds seem really strong if you are beating on low threat level enemies, especially if you are a level 50 character attacking open world enemies. The threat level system also means that the most challenging content in the game should be low leveling missions, completing them while the enemies are a very high threat level. And of course, you can design builds around all the debuffs that you get. For more information, I'll link the original Reddit post that I saw that tested this way back in the beginning of the game. However, I believe the values have changed since 1.5, so you can probably check out some mods that modify this behavior or ask modders themselves for more accurate details about threat level. Netrunning. So Netrunning is the most broken build that you don't need to invest any attributes on for it to be good. First of all, it is the only legendary operating system that does not require any attributes. Sandevistans or Sandevistans require reflexes, Berserk requires body, but Cyberdex only require the street cred that you need to purchase it. You can get legendary quick hacks at 3 intelligence. As soon as you finish Act 1, you can find access points in the city center and Haywood areas that require no intelligence to hack. Most of the access points in high level areas have a chance to drop legendary quick hacks. However, since it's only a chance, you may want to save scum these points to get the quick hacks that you want. At 3 intelligence, I got the majority of legendary quick hacks, and you can buy the epic ones from Netrunning vendors. Memory wipe is OP. Using cyber psychos as an example, the most optimal way of taking them down is one-hitting them with a tech weapon. However, if you don't have the damage for that, simply hacking them with memory wipe, walking up to them, and using a stealth takedown is the easiest. Make use of the legendary short circuit passive. The legendary short circuit passive deals ridiculous amounts of damage if you have high crit chance. You can see the short circuit passive triggering by the sparks flying after critting an enemy. It pairs extremely well with weapons that have a high attack per second or weapons that fire multiple projectiles.
Fuck! Of course you're here!
Next, there are 3 vendors that you can kill. Depending on your decisions during certain quests, there are 3 vendors that you can kill and the 1 maelstrom that you can access if you side with Royce. Without spoiling too much, there are 2 Ripper Dogs, Fingers in Japan Down and Charles in Watson. All Rippers have unique cyberware that can only be purchased at that specific store, so you can buy their gear before completing quests associated with them or make non-violent decisions during those quests. Charles, for instance, you can actually extort for cheaper prices if you want to keep him alive.
Maybe? Could I interest you in a discount? everything. On everything.
A discount? For what? Pretending I don't know how you supply your parts?
Yeah, yes.
Sure. Deal. Basement's already forgotten.
The last one is the melee vendor in the Animals Gym in Rancho Coronado. You can access this vendor after defeating Rhino during the Beat on the Brat quest. However, if you break into the gym before the Beat on the Brat fight, or complete the gig For My Son, he will aggro on the player and start fighting. This is the only vendor that sells the legendary crafting specs for the Tanto and the knife. He also sells a legendary version of one of the new knives, the Neurotoxin. You can likely find crafting specs for these in the open world, but remember that loot is RNG since patch 1.5, so you may not find them. The next one's an important one: learn the loot system. Cyberpunk 2077's loot system has received several drastic overhauls over several patches, but the most significant changes came in patch 1.5, and combined with the clothing vendor changes, or nerfs, it's more important than ever to understand the loot system. In general, there are more lootable containers in locations than at launch. However, the loot pool has expanded dramatically, and as such you won't be able to collect everything in a single playthrough. Throughout the world, you'll find that some containers are constant or unchanging, whereas others are random. But in those random containers, you have the potential of finding some of the best loot. Personally, I'd consider legendary variations of the new weapons and muzzles that were introduced in patch 1.5 and 1.6, the ones that are featured in the additional content tab, to be currently quite rare and things that you must keep. I've completed roughly 2.5 playthroughs since 1.5, 1.6 and 1.61, and some examples are this gig in Watson, Many Ways to Skin a Cat, where you can raid a Tiger Claw warehouse. There are 4 randomized containers with the potential of good loot, whereas some gigs like Wakako's Favorite and A Shrine Defiled, where these 2 pieces of clothing which could roll as legendary were always present. Often the loot that is found on the ground or on tables are also constant, but generally they're not legendary, so they're not as strong. Okay, so starting with iconics. Iconics are powerful variants of weapons that have specialized effects. You can tell that weapons are iconic based on the circuitry pattern in the background of the weapon, and on the top right of the weapon card it'll say iconic. In general, iconics can be found at NCPD suspected organized crimes, in missions, side missions, and a couple lying around throughout the open world in specific locations. Some iconics are locked behind player decisions, for example Doom Doom. Doom Doom is my favorite revolver as it fires multiple projectiles and is really strong. However, this means that Dum Dum must survive the All Foods encounter, and you have to kill him later to get it to drop. Regardless, since iconics are quite strong and constant, they're generally good weapons to build around. How about non-iconics? So non-iconic loot can be categorized into 2 different pools. Pool 1 consists of common, uncommon, rare, and epic, while Pool 2, unlocked at around level 32, consists of epic and legendary. These rarities can be re-rolled by save scumming or running far away enough and returning for the rarity to re-roll. In general, providing you are high level enough, you should be able to find at least 1 legendary item in each gig. Next, know which bonus effects to keep and when to re-roll. I made a video where I tested the non-iconic bonus effects that can be found on guns during various gigs, NCPD crime loot, and you can save scum vendors to get them as well. Some of these bonus effects can make non-iconic weapons on par with their iconic counterparts, and in very niche situations, even better. Here is a spreadsheet with the non-iconic effects. I'm going to highlight a few here. For power, the reduced draw time and 20% damage increase is probably the best damage-wise, whereas the eliminates vertical recoil while aiming is also really good for those that struggle with gun recoil. For smart weapons, they're all actually pretty good, so it's up to personal preference. I personally don't use the Smart Link cyberware and like to keep the ricochet hands, so the bonus effects that remove the requirement of using Smart Link is my go-to. For tech weapons, the reduced weapon charge time is actually insane. This works amazingly on the DB2 Satara shotgun. Of course, there's also the fires 2 rounds at once in exchange for a slower fire rate, which works really well with the new Senko Tech SMG and the Nekomata. Finally, there's increased damage from charged tech weapons by a maximum of 40%, which is also a good one to try out. A few things to keep in mind. If you're looting from containers, the higher level the player is, the greater the chance it'll be a higher rarity, and the number of mod slots are random, so it may take a while to get a perfect roll. You can also save scum legendaries at vendors to roll for these effects. Next, look out for clothing with bonus effects. Clothing stats were hard nerfed in patch 1.5, they more than halved the number of mod slots, reduced the stats on clothing mods, and restricted the clothing mods to specific slots, making some of them unstackable. Here is a table where I've divided the clothing mods by what piece of clothing they can attach to. Using crit stacking as an example, in the past you could stack crit damage mods which are now locked to only the face clothing, and face clothing only has one mod slot available. There were also further nerfs to the early game clothing and clothing mods in patch 1.6 as they drastically changed the inventory of clothing stores, removing clothing mods, crafting specs, and the 4 pieces of guaranteed legendary clothing which was at every store. However, what they did add in patch 1.5 is bonus stats in exchange for 1 mod slot, and in patch 1.61 they fixed some of the best bonus stats, specifically crit damage and quick hack cooldown reduction, which were not working previously. Here is a spreadsheet that I've made of the possible stats that can roll on clothing. I may have missed a couple, so feel free to let me know in the comments. There are roughly 2 pools that clothing can be categorized in. Pool 1 rolls on most clothing, and I've listed the equivalent clothing mod name next to the bonus stats, whereas Pool 2 are unique buffs that only appear on specific types of clothing. Of the clothing bonus stats, I personally prefer and recommend the most offensive ones like crit damage, bonus damage against enemies of a specific threat level, and quick hack cooldown reduction. There are of course some exceptions to these pools, such as clothing picked up before patch 1.5 and items that can be collected from legendary sets. The next tip is use the legendary clothing sets. There are at least 9 legendary clothing sets that have existed since launch, and these pieces of clothing are guaranteed legendaries at any level. The legendary clothing allows you to get good stats very early in the game, and you can even find legendary clothing mods on them, so it's worth re-rolling them. Next, use weapon and clothing mods. Weapon and clothing mods help with everything, providing good offensive stats including damage, attack speed, or reload speed, solid defensive options like armor or immunity to damage over time effects, and utility, like allowing you to land silently or eliminating recoil. It's always a good idea to customize your weapons and clothing based on your preferred playstyle and the enemies you are facing. For example, when fighting Netrunners, they currently only use overheat, so having immunity to burn just nullifies it completely. So mods are quite powerful, but it can be somewhat annoying knowing how to collect them all. So let's go through some of them. For gun and clothing mods, there are 4 main methods. Crafting them if you find a crafting spec, crafting clothing that may randomly have mods attached. The next method is looting, whether that be an unattached mod by itself in a container, or finding a mod pre-applied to weapons or clothing and then salvaging it off. And finally, there's purchasing from vendors. Of all the mods, these are the mods that it is relatively common to find a crafting spec for. You can find crafting specs for other mods, but they're seemingly quite rare. For the craftable mods, you need to level up your crafting progression to unlock each tier. Common is from levels 1 to 3, Uncommon unlocks at level 4, Rare unlocks at level 9, Epic at level 14, and Legendary at level 18. The crafting progression requirements were added all the way back in patch 1.3 when they added the Legendary tier for mods, and that's when I originally covered it. A few final notes on mods. Most of the non-craftable mods can either be bought from vendors or found in set locations and missions. For example, The melee mods can be purchased from vendors at a rare tier, but you can loot a couple of epic ones in certain NCPD events. However, for most of the non-craftable clothing mods, your best bet is to salvage them off clothing that you either find in the open world or clothing you've crafted yourself. For example, to get a legendary version of the Hackslinger mod, I save scummed the media cap until it appeared. Okay, moving on to the next tip. The best defense is a good offense. Killing enemies before they detect you, or defeating bosses before they can even attack, is way better than speccing into defensive attributes or perks. Stealth gameplay has been changed significantly over time with faster rates of detection. However, with the rework of the ninjutsu tree and throwing knives, stealth builds are extremely effective at one-shotting enemies. In patch 1.3, optical camo was added, which makes stealth combat easier, especially if you have enough damage to one-hit enemies in quick succession. The next tip is stack damage multipliers. I've previously mentioned stacking the level 20 progression perks, but stacking those with other multipliers will result in the highest damage in the game. In general, multipliers are calculated by adding the stats on the weapon card to the ones on the stats page. Make sure that the weapon is equipped before calculating your total damage, as some perks only show up if you check the inventory page once the weapon is wielded. Let's start with crit. Crit applies to all weapons, even quick hacks and grenades, providing you have the perks to enable them to crit. Crit pairs extremely well with legendary short circuit, and if you remember my netrunning tips, you can run a legendary short circuit without needing to invest into any intelligence. If you are going for a level 50 playthrough, I highly recommend stacking crit for every late game build. For example, the highest single shot damage in the game is currently stacking assault weapon modifiers, headshot damage, and the charge multiplier from tech weapons and crit damage. Next, there's ricochet damage. The ricochet damage multiplier is restricted to power weapons and was the only damage multiplier that was buffed in patch 1.5. Although all power weapons can use ricochet damage, it is best utilized on weapons that can add a muzzle brake. For example, light machine guns, sniper rifles, and shotguns can ricochet shots. However, they cannot add muzzle brakes, unlike assault rifles, SMGs, and pistols, which can add those muzzles or silencers. Ricocheted shots auto-lock onto enemies, mostly hitting center mass, and if you stack crit multipliers with ricochet damage, you get the highest DPS against tankier enemies. Here is a list of the muzzle brakes that you can choose from. Keep in mind that the highest ricochet damage buffs reduce weapon crit chance, but this does not halve the crit chance on the stats page. However, there are also some muzzle brakes that do not reduce crit chance and therefore do not have any downsides in guns blazing scenarios, and these muzzles are a must-have. One stat that is not shown completely is the chance for bullets to ricochet. If you take a look at the ballistic coprocessor cyberware, it states that it increases the chance to ricochet shots, whereas the muzzle brake provides a percentage. In the case of Epic, it's a 40% increase. Seemingly, if you have both the ballistic coprocessor and a muzzle brake equipped, it guarantees that the shots do ricochet. I've got a video where I test these more in depth, so I'll link that in the description. One final note is that the rarest item in the game are legendary muzzles, so if you find one, be sure to keep it, as they deal significantly more damage compared to their epic versions. Finally, bullet time or time slow cyberware makes you untouchable. There are 5 types of bullet time or time slow cyberware currently, and while active, you move faster than enemies and projectiles. This allows you to easily sidestep or jump around enemy attacks. Since time slow cyberware basically prevents damage or even detection, they are a defensive utility option that enables aggressive gameplay. The 5 pieces of cyberware are Kiroshi Optics. In the nervous system, there's Reflex Tuner, Synaptic Accelerator, and Kerenzikov. And finally, there's the Sandev Stan operating system. Starting with Kiroshi Optics.
Kiroshi Optics. best I've got.
You can get common Kuroshi optics as soon as you visit Victor's clinic, and the time slow activates whenever you scan an enemy. Kuroshi optics can be used with any operating system, and although you cannot attack while using it, you can perform other actions such as reloading, using quick hacks, avoiding detection, and retreating behind cover. Kuroshis have no cooldown and an infinite duration, which makes them incredibly useful for combat. One final note is that you can turn off other time slow mechanics by scanning an enemy. The nervous system options are short bursts of time slows, and each has a different condition to trigger. Reflex Tuner triggers at 25% HP, Synaptic Accelerator triggers when you are detected by an enemy, and Kerenzikov triggers when you aim while sliding or dodge while aiming. The time slow on these cyberware only lasts for 2 to 4 seconds depending on rarity, but that's more than enough to avoid detection or flank enemies. Unlike the Kuroshis, you can attack during these slows, making it incredible for peeking around corners, out of cover, or getting into melee range without getting hit. Finally, there's the Sandevistan operating systems. While active, Sandevistans provide some damage buffs and slows time for a much longer duration compared to the nervous system cyberware. In patch 1.5, most damage and crit sources got hard nerfed. However, Sandevistans only received slight nerfs in comparison. This makes the Sandevistans or Sandevistans extremely useful in the early game and later if you do not crit cap from other sources. Although, if you already crit cap, Sandevistans are less useful as it only provides time slow. If you're going for pure damage, then Legendary Short Circuit passive is much stronger, providing you have enough crit chance. One final note about the time slow cyberware is that they pair extremely well with optical camo, since the optical camo duration is slowed down as well. Hopefully you found these build tips useful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll be going over some of my builds in future, so be sure to subscribe. See you next time, Chooms.